Says the Gemara, we're up to here. Kulna Block Gemara. Today's daf is daf Ayin Vav Amud Aleph Masechta Yevamos, and we're middling discussing the sugya of Suadaka. So the Gemara says over here about 10 lines on the top of the page. Sholach le Rava Breya de Rabba. Rabba had a son called Rava, and he sent a letter to Rabbi Yosef because Rabba passed away young. So Rabbi Yosef obviously was Rosh Hashiva then. So it's just interesting that the Rabba had a son called Rava, Rabbi Yosef had a son called Abaya. So obviously they loved their Talmidim. So Lamdeda may teach us, how do you make the determination? How do you know whether you had a keri or not? Because you're not allowed to be moitzi shichozel vatali. You're not allowed to produce a keri, deliberately. Amalei said to him, this is what we do. You place a loaf of bread that is hot, made out of barley, and you put it by his anus, and that the heat will come through him, and that will cause him to have a keri because he feels warm down there. The idea is you're not allowed to be mighty shichozer levatala. Here it's not levatala. Here you're doing it for a very good reason. You want to determine whether this person is a psuadaka or not. Whether if he has a keri, will open up the puncture again or it won't. So therefore, you're allowed to produce. On the other hand, you're still not allowed to still producing it manually. So what alternative methods are there? So this is one method he came up with. And this is to do also with halachic ways of how you can do IVF, and yet you have the problem of shichozer vatala. So a different way. Amar Abai says, "Otu kuli alma Yaakov." Everyone's like Yaakov that they never had a keri before, and therefore, the very first time the keri comes out very quickly. The Chesiv by Yaakov says, "Koichi b'reishis only." Yaakov was 84 years old when he had. Or 77 when he had Reuven, and he declared Koichi v'reishis oini, and he says, "This is my first time ever at that age. You never had a keri before." So, but most people are not this way, and because most people are not this way, you can't expect it to be that this is what's going to happen. It's not going to produce anything. So then, what it says. So the Gemara continues. Different opinions whether Yaakov married at 77 and then started having children, or he had to work 7 years before he could get married, and therefore he didn't get married till 84 and have his children. But even 77 is a long time. Elon Baba says, what they did was they put on lewd clothing or non-sleazy clothing in front of him, and that got him excited, and that caused him to have a keri. Omar says, is everybody like Basili Hagilodi, who was definitely somebody who lusted all the time, so therefore he readily comes, because we see this Basili Hagilodi, he was 80 years old when Don Melech invited him to join him in Shalayim, and the Gemara says he had a maid who was 92 years old, and he at 80 looked much older than the maid at 92. And the reason is because the expression is shatuv bezimah. He was immersed totally in zinus and so on, or in zima, in balkeri. So not everybody's like that. So it doesn't happen so easily. We go back to our original answer, which is we put that hot bread, and eventually that's what happens. It causes the keri to come out. We learn if let's say there was a puncture through and through, makes him up to a puzzle. So he's puzzled from joining the full group nature choices, because whenever he gets excited, the keri will come out through one of these punctures. And the idea, because it comes out through a puncture, it's not able to be yoyde kechetz. It doesn't shoot like an arrow, and therefore you're not able to procreate, to have children. Says the Gemara, but if you're closed up, kosher is kosher. Now it forces the puncture is closed up, so it forces the semen to come out through the right channel, and therefore you can procreate. Then the Braisa continues. This is a kind of a psul that can be remedied. as opposed to what? Opposed to what? When it comes, let's say, to the lung, and we know that if there's a puncture in the lung, and it grows over by a lung, we don't say, oh, now that there's a growth on top of it, it's good enough. The enocotum, we say that eventually the membrane that grew on top of it will fall off, and therefore it's still considered a treifa animal. So how do we know? Yeah. How do we actually fix up? Let's say you had a puncture. You tell me if there's a skin that grows over it, it's good. So how do you cause the skin to grow over it? How do you remedy that? So he said the following: Mycin and Sa'art, you bring a piece of barley, sartinale, and you make it very, very sharp. And then you and it's a sharp piece of barley, and you go around the puncture and you scratch it. And the idea is when you scratch it, you make it bleed. And when you make it bleed, it's going to cause eventually for it to dry and the skin to grow over it. But then you bring fats, and so sticky. The shaifina, and then you smear all over the area. Then you go ahead and you bring a large ant, a living one. And you place it where the puncture is, and the ant will eat into the wax, and then his head will get stuck into it. You cut the rest of the body off, and then what happens is the head stays there and slowly disintegrates, and that's how you cover the hole. Don't ask any questions. But we can only use something like a barley, which is not that sharp. But if you let's use a piece of metal, let's say a knife or something, or a blade, what's going to happen is it's going to cause another wound, or it's going to cause it to swell. You're not going to gain anything. And this is all talking about cotton. This is all talking about that if it's a small little hole. That if it's a large hole, it's not going to help because mikpule. Eventually, whatever will grow there will fall away. It only works if it's a puncture, not a hole. Rabbeinu says, before we learned before that if your semen comes out from the wrong hole, we said that what between Bibi Barabaya and a puppy. Everybody said it's still kosher as long as the semen is coming out. And a puppy said because it's coming out the wrong hole, it doesn't work. That's the problem when the semen comes out from the channel where the urine is supposed to come out. What about the other way around? What about the semen comes out from the right channel, but your urine comes out from both channels? He wanted to say apostle. Omar Rabba says Rabba. This is Rav Huna's son Rabba, which we learned a number of times things in his name. Omar Rabba said less hilchos. The halach is loikebro, not like Rav Huna's son. In this case, he just said v'loika abba, nor like his father. Now this is very interesting what Rav Huna said. Bro had Amram, what we just said. Abba, what did Rav Huna say that halach is not like him? The Amar Rav Huna said, Noshim hamisaydle zuluzu, women that are lesbians. Psulas lakuna, they are considered a zoina, and they are apostle to marry a kohen. Now, Tesis brings an interesting shot here that from some others that they want to say it's not about lesbians. It's talking about that for whatever reason the women would take the shichva zera from the husbands and put on each other whatever it is, which means that they have to be married in order for this to be a problem. And Tesis bring proofs it's irrelevant that they're married, even single girls. So we're talking about lesbians. So according to Rav Huna, lesbians are also just like homosexuals, and therefore it's also through kohen. And then he goes further. I feel that Rabbi Lazar, even according to Rabbi Lazar. So Rabbi says that he's totally wrong. And why? He said Rabbi goes further. Not only is he totally wrong because he's not a zoyin, I feel that Rabbi Lazar, but even Rabbi Lazar says that if it's a single guy and a single girl who are not committing really any Isur and V'naisa, if they have relations not for the sake, even one off, not for the sake of getting married. It's already considered zayin. Nevertheless, in the case of lesbians, even Rabbi Lazar would say it's not zayin at all, says Rabbi, not like Rav Huna. Hani mili ish, that's only talking about a man. Aval isha, when it comes to women, is plitusa b'alma. The behavior is only immodest and promiscuous, but does not render them a zayin at all. So interesting machlekes in halach with Rav Huna and Rabbi. Says the Gemara, that looks like Rabbi. Says the Gemara Mishnah. Continuing to Tzudaka, Bekrushavcha, up Tzudaka and a Krushavcha, ones we're learning about till now. So either that was wounded or crushed, or cut or krushavcha, there was a cut off completely. Is the then is mutari? They're permitted to marry a giyush. They're not allowed to marry into the kol. They're not allowed to marry a Yisrael, but they're allowed to marry a Giyadis. It's not part of the kol. We will have a machlekes tanoim if Giyadis is considered part of the kol or not, but we pass like Rabbi Yossi that's not. And it's in conclusion. And they're allowed to marry Enish Yuchretz. The Ein and Asur of Lom Kol. Only thing Tzedakah cannot do is marry Yisrael. Remember, it says, that they shouldn't enter the Kol Hashem. But otherwise, they can marry anybody else. Says the Gemara, Bo, min name Rav Sheshes. Somebody asked Rav Sheshes an interesting question. Okay, you tell me if Tzedakah can marry, it's very limited who he can marry, only Yidden who are not part of the Kol. A Giyadis, a Shivcha. So what about a Koyin Tzedakah, who's not allowed to marry a Giyadis and a Shechreres? What happens then? Because do we say, and what's the shaila? But as follows: Tzedakah Koyin, Mahu, can he marry Giyadis? As a Koyin, he's not allowed to marry Giyadis. But now he's a Tzedakah. So what's pshat by Tzedakah? Is the pshat he's a full-fledged Koyin, but he's just not allowed to marry into the Kol? Or the pshat is that he lost his kedusha as a kohen because of the tzedakah. It completely takes away, strips him from any of his kedusha. Now the machlekes in the Rishonim or further, when this question that he loses his kedusha, is it only insofar as marriage is concerned, or let's say losing bichas, the right to do bichas kohen, if he's not a kohen anymore? On the other hand, it's hard to understand that opinion because we learned before that a tzedakah is permitted to eat truma. So that clearly tells us that Tzedakah is still considered a kohen. He's like a truma. So it must be the Gemara's question is limited only to marriage because he cannot marry a kol, and he can only marry Yeshua and something like that. So maybe in this case, the Torah said, well, he doesn't have the Isser of he doesn't have that aspect of kohen or kedusha to marry only Israel. So maybe he could marry Giyos. That's a question. So now, he's still a kohen, but he loses his kohen and he's allowed to. I want to say to you, so I'll prove it to you. Forget about a kohen. Let's talk about a Yisrael. A Tzedakah Yisrael is allowed to marry a Nesinim. Who were the Nesinim? The Nesinim were one of the 7 nations that Hashem told Yeshua you have to destroy. And when they heard about it, they were frightened, and they masqueraded as some distant from a foreign country, and with not a native tongue, an alien tongue, and they came along and they said to Yeshua, can we join the people? And Yeshua swore to them to take care of them. And after they converted them, they realized that these were the Givonim. So Yeshua decided, because of a Chil Hashem, to backtrack on his shvur. He won't backtrack, so he accepted them, but he turned them into water carriers and wood choppers. And they're called Nesinim because it says by Yitnem Yeshua. Yeshua made them, so they're called an Nesinim. And the Nesinim, you're not allowed to marry. But yet it says that a Tzedakah is allowed to marry a Nesinim. So if a Tzedakah is allowed to marry a sinner, a Yisrael, that means that he loses the specialty of Yisrael. Any other Yisrael is not allowed to marry a sinner, but a Tzedakah can't marry. When it comes to Giyadis Yecheres, everybody can marry Giyadis Yecheres. So it doesn't take away his kedusha. But we see that a Yisrael cannot marry a sinner, and yet a Tzedakah can. What does that mean? That he lost his kedusha. So the same with a kohen, he loses the kedusha of a kohen. And because he loses the kedusha of a kohen, he could marry a Giyadis. That's what Rav Sheshes wanted to say. Tzedakah Yisrael mutar b'nesinim. Now, Yitzchak Dagner Shosik can tell me that while Tzedakah has the same kedusha, whatever kedusha is, as a kohen, as Yisrael, and so on and so forth. And then, so how come Yisrael allowed to marry a sinner? It says in the Torah clearly you're not allowed to marry any of the 7 nations. So how can you marry this sinner? Omar Rava says, Rava, what are you talking about? Or to have some mission kedusha, v'lav kedusha who? You think when the Torah says latest chatan bam, we're talking about after they converted, and it's a question of kedusha. We're talking about when they were still goyim. The Torah says don't marry the 7 nations if they weren't megayer, and as goyim. And why not? Because if you marry one of them, deal with Ben and Moilid Ben, you'll have a child. It'll be a goy and behave like a goy. The Hani Mili. So when did the Torah Asa Loitis Chattenbaum only be Yosef? When couldn't you marry the sin and all the other 6 nations, and all that, only while they were goyim? But if they converted, be so sharum. How Torah, if these people converted, they're no longer considered part of the 7 nations. Now you can marry them. Nonetheless, how come we still say you're not allowed to marry the sin? It's only the Rabbanon. The Rabbanon came along and said, we don't want you to marry a Jewish sin. So therefore, I can say, so therefore, by Tzedakah, when we said Tzedakah, you can marry a sinner, all we did was we took away the East of the Rabbanon. Not because he lost his Kedusha. There never was Kedusha. We're talking about a Yid over here, a Yid sinner. The East of the Torah is only about Goy. The Chigazu Rabbanon. So when did Rabbanan say don't marry a sinner if you can produce further children? You can have children. I will hide the lie by Lord. Since you cannot have any children, you're not going to produce any more people from that, descendants of these sinner. No, that's what Rabbi wants to say. Sitting when I ask a question to Rabbi, so according to your logic, a mamzer should not be able to marry in a sinner because with Rabban you're not allowed to marry. We're worried about future generations, and you tell me Tzedakah can because there's no future generations, so a mamzer shouldn't be able to. And what's the problem with that? Mamzer the barude hachinami also, but now we learn mamzer in the sinner. Mamzer is allowed to marry in the sinner. So he modifies the statement. Ella, you're right. I still maintain that when the Torah said like this chatan bam is only talking about while they are goyim. And once they become Yidden, Mahatari, you're allowed to marry them. The Rabban Asid. So why by Psu Adaka did they lift the Isser, or why by Mamza did they lift the Isser? A Mamza is still a Yid, has still Kaddish and everything else. Elaki goes at Rabban the big shady. Rabban only goes by people who are kosher to come into the cult. But the Psulim, those are disqualified, cannot marry into the cult. Like goes about Rabban goes Then Hodor Amarava thought about it again. This happens a number of times. The Rabbi was from the few Amoraim that used to rethink what he said, and he wouldn't shy away from coming back and saying, "You know what? I changed my mind." Or sometimes he said, "I made a mistake." What I said is not right. I said it's not right. When the Torah said "Leitus Chat," what I said was the Torah was talking about you're not allowed to marry these 7 nations, which sounds like, by the way, that you only know the Islam HaTorah of marrying is only a goy, is only the 7 nations. The rest of the word goyim is not also HaTorah to marry. Now he says there's no Islam HaTorah to marry any of them. We see. The Torah, when Torah says don't marry them, can't be talking about a goy because there's no marriage by goy. There's no kedushin. What's marriage? So when the Torah says don't marry the 7 nations, it must be talking about even if they converted, don't marry any of them. This guy do islu chasnas, but if they were megayer, that's when you can get married. And therefore, says Rabbah, that you cannot marry them only when they're a yid, and yet up to a darker's lie marrying a sinner. Why? There's nothing to do with Rabbanans here. This is Mahatayda. Must be that he lost his kedusha, and must be that Sheshes is right. Up to a koydaka is koyin can marry a geyedis, can marry a he lost his kedusha. Tosis holds that marrying a goy is Mahatayla Asad, but he can't be from like this Chattenbam because we just said that can only reply to Yidden. So Tosis says from the next part of the passage where it says Bitoy lesikach lebincha, that his daughter you shouldn't take to your son, and the son you shouldn't take to your daughter. So therefore, that's the Issa Mahatayla. The others hold that there is no Issa Mahatayla. So the Rabbanon. Then they want to continue because the business of Chashmonai came along and Asad, Nashgaz, and all that. Second one further, most of Rabbi Yisrael asked an interesting question. Yes. Okay, so you're telling me that like this Chatan is only talking about Toyid. Can't be talking about to a goy. So that's the question. It says in the posting where Chatan Shloim is Bas Parei Melech Mitzrayim. Shloim Melech married Bas Parei, the king of Mitzrayim. He married her, and she was a goy. So we see he could get the shaykh marriage by a goy. When I answer, what's the shaykh? Giyuda Gaida. She was Megaya. She converted. When Shloim Melech married her, she was already Yid. Says the Gemara, like Kiblu Gaida, but they didn't accept any Gaida in the times of David Shlomo. So therefore, her Gaidus wasn't valid. So she was still a goy, and yet it says that Moshe Shlomo married her. So the Gemara says, no. What's the reason why we didn't accept Gaida in the times of David Shlomo? David, because everybody was scared of David, and Shlomo because everybody loved Shlomo, because times were good, and they thought, financially we'll be much better off if we become a Yid. But Bas Parei had no reason to marry Shlomo for financial reason because she was royalty already. She was Bas Parei. So therefore, if she became a Yid, it must be genuine. So the Gemara immediate time, no reason why you don't accept them is because they want the royalty, they think that everything will be wonderful when they become Yid. She didn't need it. So therefore, if she did it, she became a full-fledged Yid, a proper Yid. That's why it says Vayizchat. Says the Gemara, a table on mitzvah sheni. Was a question, but she was a mitzvah. She still, even though she became a yid, he still was not allowed to marry her because she was a mitzvah sheni. And yet it says that they were married. That's how Rashi learns. Everybody else asks. Of course, we learned before that that kedushin is chal. By chayav, I say there's mitzvah say that that's my mitzvah, but there's a kedushin is chal. So therefore, it's a vayizchat. So what's the Gemara's question? So some first say the question is, why bother going through the conversion process? Either way, there's an Aveda. As a mitzvah is an Aveda, as a goy is an Aveda, and could be the Aveda as a goy is even less than the Aveda of a mitzvah, because that's a decent Torah, and the Aveda goy might not be in this Torah. So why did he bother going through the motions of Gerus? very difficult to understand Gemara's question because living with a guy is much worse. The children will be going. Mashengi will admit the children will be Jewish. So it's a difficult question to understand exactly what the Gemara is asking. Teresa said the Gemara is asking is, but at the end of the day, how did Shlomo marry her? He was committing an avera. That's the Gemara's question, which in the wording doesn't sound so right, but that's what Teresa learned the question is. How does Shlomo marry her? She was a mitzi, a bas mitzi. You're not allowed to marry a mitzi until the third generation. Says the Gemara, you're going to tell me. We know that Sancherib came along and moved everybody around, but Sancherib didn't live in the times of Shlomo Melech. He was much later, in the time of Chizkiah Melech. So if you can tell me that all the Mitzrim way before that have left, and therefore she wasn't really a Mitzri, there was no Issa there. And now Rashi says an interesting thing here. Rashi says 2 lines on the top, I'll just say it inside. What do you mean all the Mitzrim left? Where did they go? Hanich Azal Alma, they left. Mesu, they all died. The Tobu b'mei pare. Rashi says every single Egyptian came to the Yamsuf and died. So when the Torah came along, it must be the women as well, because if the women remain behind, what do we gain? The women are still of Mitzri. So everyone died in the days of Pare. So what's the Torah telling me don't marry Mitzri? There's no Mitzrim left. There's not one Mitzri left. They all died. Men, women, and children must be. Because if the children are still alive, then what's Rashi saying? Is Me'ed of Rav. It's the Mitzrim who joined the Yidden and they converted. There wasn't really a proper conversion or whatever. Those are the people that Abisha said, don't marry the Eid of Rav. And that, if that's correct, what Rashi learns and it explains to you why the Eid of Rav constantly tried to undermine Moshe Rabbeinu's authority, because they were disenfranchised. They were marginalized. They couldn't get married to the Yidden. Very interesting. That's what Rashi says. Tosfos doesn't follow that at all. Tosfos says, not at all. He just says that other people moved into Mitzrayim. The other people moved into Mitzrayim, not that they all died. A number of Mitzrayim died, Yamsuf, not that they all died. It could very well be, for some reason or another, that the people of Mitzrayim who lived at the time of the story of Mitzrayim, they all emigrated to some other country, emigrated from Mitzrayim, went somewhere else, and other people moved into Mitzrayim. Not that they all died. So I think one of us, anyway. But it can't be because Hatanya we learned. Oh, but Rabbi Yehuda said. So you're telling me that Mitzrim are not no longer Mitzrim. Shlomo was allowed to marry. Rabbi Yehuda said Binyamin Ger Mitri Hayili Chavab. Rabbi Yehuda said I had a friend called Binyamin. He was a friend and he was a student of Rabbi Akiva. So he was a student of Rabbi Akiva. Interesting. When was this? This is before the 24,000 Talmidim passed away. Rabbi Yehuda wasn't yet a Talmid of Rabbi Akiva. He lived in the south, unless Rabbi Yehuda knew some of the Talmidim of Rabbi Akiva. And after they all passed away, he still had the courage to join Rabbi Akiva. Omar, he said, "Ani Mitzrishan, this Binyamin was a Mitzri." He said, "I'm a Mitzri. My wife, I married a Mitzri. Because I married a Jewish woman. And I'll make sure that my son will marry will be a second generation Mitzri. Will marry a girl who's a second generation Mitzri, so that their kids will be proper Yidden, because if his son marries a Mitzri, the first generation, then their kids will be a second generation. Whichever one is closer up the line, that's the generation the children are considered. So we see clear from here that even many years after Shlomo Melech, there was still Mitzrim there. There was still Mitzri. So that's the question. Now the Tosfos already asks, but by the time Rabbi Akiva was around, Sancherib already mixed everybody up, including all the Mitzrim. So Tosfos wants to say, interesting thing, that Mitzrayim is different than all other nations. They were given a timetable. You're leaving for 40 years and then you return. Ammon also was told that one day they'll return, but they're never given a timetable. So we don't know if they ever return or when they come, Mashiach will come. But Mitzrayim, definitely, they all came back. So the Mitzrayim is still the same Mitzrayim. So those people who want to answer, you're allowed to go to Mitzrayim today because Sancherib, Biblical Oilim, which a number of Shayim say, Tosfos says, no, you can't. Because the Mitzrayim today are the same Mitzrayim as back then. Or descendants of theirs. Papa says, so what do you ask me? Go back to the question of Shlomo Melech, how did he marry? Bas Paroi, a very interesting Gemara says now. So change till now, we're saying that she was genuine, the problem is at Mitzri, and we're saying that no, it was maybe different Mitzri. And the Gemara doesn't accept that because Binyamin gave a Mitzri. So Papa said, Anan Mishloima Leikim and Nasir, you can ask me a question of Shlomo Melech's behavior. Shlomo Lenasir. Shlomo Melech actually never married her. Shlomo never married her. Lenasir means he didn't marry at all. It says in the pasuk, he was told of from the nation Hashem told you not to join. The nation join you. Because they will tilt your hearts towards their gods, their idols, and Behem Dovak Shlomo La'ava, and that Shlomo Melech cleaved to them with love. In other words, he didn't marry, he never married Bas Pari. He just lived with her. Very difficult. And Bas Pari brought Avodah Zarah into the house, wasn't even married, and Shlomo never chased her away, he never chased Avodah Zarah away. Hard to understand, to explain what happened there. Elakasha said they have a problem by his chatan. So why does the pasuk say that he married her when he never married Bas Pari? So more answers, but they were so much in love, and that he was besotted by her, that it's considered as if they were married. So interesting. So like de facto would be you can refer to it as vayischat. We're not talking about legally here. We're talking about behavior wise. So you can refer to it as vayischat. I have a question that you're telling me that a P'tur Daka is allowed to marry on a sinner. And yeah, that was the whole basis for Rav Shesha saying that a P'tur Daka Kohen loses Kedusha. So that's a question. It says in Vanan, it says in the Mishnah that a P'tur Daka, in our Mishnah, it says P'tur Daka Krushavcha Mutorin allowed to marry Gielis and Meshachreres. Hoben a sinner, Asida. The fact that the Mishnah only allows them a Gielis could have a bigger Chiddush. You're allowed to marry in a sinner. In which a Yisrael is not allowed to, and you can. That would have been a much bigger chiddush. Does not prove the Mishnah does not hold it like the Braisa says. Don't bring a proof of the Braisa that a Yisrael is allowed to marry in a sinner, therefore you lose the kedusha. We say our Mishnah doesn't hold of that. Amalei, he said, you want to be so pedantic. Let me ask a question. Read the continuing the Mishnah. The time make. Aim say for the Mishnah continues. The ain and asur, and the only thing that a P'tur is forbidden is malava kol, marrying a full-fledged yid. According to you, the Mishnah should have said that a bigger chiddush cannot even marry in a sinner, even someone who's not a full-fledged yid. A P'tur cannot marry his mashmah in a sinner shadi. You're allowed to marry in a sinner. You can't bring a proof either way. Mishnah. So continuing, people who are not allowed to marry into the call, Amoni, a member of the nation of Ammon or Moavi, Asurim, they are Asr. They are not allowed to marry into the Jewish fold. The Isur and Isur Olam. It doesn't matter how many generations down track, if you are descended from Ammon and Moav, it is forbidden. But only males. Avonik Vaseyem Mutaris Miyad. But an Amoni, like Rus, Moavi, or Naama Hanamainus, who was married to Shlomo Melech, was the mother of Rechavam, who became the next king of Israel. And then you know the descendants were Chizkiah Melech and so on. That they were allowed to marry. It's only the males, not the females. Now the reason cannot be because it's written in masculine form, because a lot of parts of the Torah are written in masculine form, even though it includes both genders. So we'll soon see how we know that. But the girls are put straight away. Mitzri, when it comes to Mitzri, makes no difference male or female. When it came with male, if he makes no difference, but they only have 2 generations forbidden, the 3 generations permitted. Shimon Matis and the cave in Shimon holds no, definitely by Mitzri and by a Doimi, their females are permitted straight away. Have a Kavachayman. What's a Kavachayman? I'm not sure Kavachayman. Ma even Mokum Shosas Chad. Israel, the place where the males are also forever, like Ammon and Moav, and yet Hittites and the caves, the females are permitted. Miyad, so a place where you acid the males for 3 generations, only 3 limited, only 2 generations, 3 generations permitted. Surely the females should be mutter. In addition, after the caves, Miyad, they should be permitted straight away. They said to him, look, im halacha nekabel. If you heard this from your rabbis, okay, there's an opinion that way. Although if you're just pure in the logic, yes, tshuva, and we can respond and undermine your whole kavachem, as we'll see later in the Gemara. I'm telling you what I heard from my rabbis. How do you know that my niece is permitted? Goliath was bellowing out there, and he says, forget about having a war. Anybody can come and challenge me, and if you kill me, then we're your slaves, and if I kill him, then you're my slaves. And for 40 days, everybody was scared. And David Melech was there one day bringing food to his brothers. When he saw what happened, he went to Shaul Melech and he pleaded, let me go and fight against Goliath. So when Shaul saw, Shaul is David the Casa Plishti, when he saw that Shaul was going out, David was going out to greet the Plishti, Omar, he said, Ben Mize Hanar, whose kid is this? Avner, tell me, whose kid is this? Avner said, I can swear to you, do I know who this kid is? Nobody knew David was. Look, see, it says a pasuk that that he already knew David, and Shaul was very fond of him. And he used to be the carrier of his garments and everything else. So what do you mean he didn't know David was? Of course he knew who it was. He was asking about Yishai, David's father. Who was he? And he didn't know Yishai, but see, it says by Yishai, it says that this elderly person, which is his name is Yishai, and Rav says, what do you mean Bob Anoshim? You tell me Rav Abba that Yishai David, whenever he came with a large entourage, so everybody was aware when he came in, everyone knew who he was. Shaul was asking Abba, tell me, who does David Melech is coming in? I look at him. He looks so proud. He looks like royal material. I'm very worried. Is he going to step on the throne? Is he coming from Yehuda? Had two sons, Peretz and Zerach. Is he coming from Peretz? Is that who he's a descendant from? And then I have to worry. Oh, Zerach. Why was Peretz called Peretz? Because Peretz eventually will become a king, and Peretz from the idea that he can breach all the walls. Kings, there's no wall that stands in the way of a king. Malka will be a king. King can break through anything and make a road. Nobody can prevent him. But if David Mel comes to Zerach, I'm not worried. Then he'll be a very chashuv person, and that's all. My time, why suddenly the Shaul asked this question now when David was going to fight Goliath? Why suddenly did it pop up? You see, because it says in Pasuk that David Melech had to put on some kind of clothes for the, to fight Goliath. It says in Pasuk, Yalbe Shaul as David, that Shaul Melech placed on David meat of his own clothes. That means that Shaul Melech, we know, was very tall, took his own clothes and put on David, and it fits so beautifully. By Shaul it says that Mashiach from Shaul is up. He was taller than everybody else. He was greater. We had humans and Sai Begashmis, and yet it fit David. He thought, some kind of messenger that David will be a future king. He said, "What are you asking if he's suitable to be a king? Ask whether he's suitable to be a Jew." What do you mean? To join the Jewish nation? My time, because he comes from Jerusalem, and says the Torah that from Moav and Ammon you shouldn't accept anybody. Avner said to Nina, so Avner right away responded, defending David. He says, Amayni, v'loy Amaynis, a male, not a female. Moavi, v'loy Moavis, a male, not a female. So therefore, David is all right from Rus. So Doeg jumped back. Now Doeg was a very big Talmid Chacham. He said, Amiata mamzer v'loy mamzeres, so make the same deal. A mamzer and not a mamzeres, so female mamzer should be all right. So Avner said, no, mamzer is not a gender. Mamzer is a word. It's a contraction of two words. Mamzer ksiv mum zar. Mamzer is mum zar. So I want that it's a strange. There's a flaw here from a zar, from the fact that someone outside of marriage is involved with his child. Nothing to do with gender. So he said, okay, what about mitzri? Make the same drasha mitzri v'loy mitzris. So he says, so shiny hoch here is different than Mefarish time of the crow because the pasuk gives a reason. Why is it that they cannot marry anybody from Moav or Ammon? They did not come forward to you with bread and water. Now the truth of the matter, that's only talking about Ammon. Moav's crime was that they hired Bilam to destroy the Eden. And Ammon's crime was, because they left Bilam straight away, Ammon's crime was that they didn't go out and bring food to the Eden. But even hiring Bilam is going to war, that's again a male-dominated effort. And the Gemara says, there's men whose role was to go out there and offer food, not the women. So the men were punished, not the women. So Doeg said, what do you mean? Why not punish the women? Okay, tznius. The men should have given food to the men, and the women from Ammon should have gone to the front and provided food for the women of the Eden. And nothing wrong with that. There's no headed tznius there. Ishtik. Here, Avner had no explanation. Don't know what to answer. Why should there be a distinction between men and women? Miyad, right away, by Yevamos Shaul, right away, then Shaul turned around, and he said. So right away he said, go find out. Go find out who this young person is. So Gemara asks, in other words, everyone was stumped by Doeg's question. and maybe there's a problem with David Melech. Hassam, that's not a side question. Hassam Karlena, previously he called him a young one, and Hacha Karle Olim, and here he called him Olim. It's also another word for young, but different word altogether. Olim is a bit older, but young. Hachi Karmele. Halacha nis alma mimeka. So he said to Shaul said to Avner that this halacha you don't remember because you got stuck. So I'll tell you what. Say v'sha'al bebeis hamedrash. Go ask this shayla bebeis hamedrash. Is David a full-fledged yid coming from a Mayavi from Rus or not? Amrulay. So he went to Avner together with David went into the shul to raise a medrash, and they all said the same thing. Actually, Doig again asked them all the same question. He visited the same question that he asked on Avner. They also got stuck. So they wanted to announce that David HaMelech should be, marginalized. Biyad immediately, Amsa, this person called Amsa, who was there. The Amsa ben Ish, he was a son of a person, Shmo Yisra HaYisraeli. His father's name was Yisra HaYisraeli. Hashabah that married Abigail Bas Nochash. Abigail was David HaMelech's sister. So Amasa was David HaMelech's was David HaMelech's nephew, and he stood up. So Bas Nochash, and Nochash is referring here to Yishai, because Yishai, we have Gemara Bas was like a Nochash that he only died because of the Nochash Akadmoni with Adam Rishon. So anyway, he got up there. Uksiv, another pasuk says, talks about the same person, says that Abigail gave birth to Amasa, and there it says the father Amasa was Yesed HaYishmaeli. The pasuk before it says Yisra, yes, the same thing, but Yisra HaYisraeli, and here's called HaYishmaeli. What does that mean? He stood up there, he girdled himself with a sword like Yishmael, and he got up there and they said, anybody who opposes this halacha that David is 100% all right because Rus was all right, I'm going to stab him with this sword. This is what I heard from the Bezdin of Shmuel and Amasi. We didn't make it up. This was Shmuel Paskin, and that's how it is. Says the Gemara, and how can we believe him? Any time that Paskins halacha, and then later an incident happens, we can rely on this halacha. But if let's say after something happened, he goes ahead and makes a psak, we cannot listen to him. Now, what's going on here? What do you mean? Every time you go to a road with a shayla, it's after the shayla happened. Well, so Taisa explains in other shayla, it means like this. Of course, if something happened, you go to the Rav and you paskas, no problem. But over here, where it is subjective, remember, when we're talking about David, we're also talking about Amasa. We're talking about this, him as well. It affects him because he was also descended from Rus. So if he would have, nobody brought it up, and he would have said this thing is one thing. But now that he's in the Geba David, and the story came up, he can no longer paskin. And every time the Gemara says this thing about how can you paskin after the event, he's always talking about someone that is personally, you're no longer objective, you are subjective. So how can we listen to Amasa? Says Here's different, because Shmuel and the Bezdin are still alive, so it's very easily verifiable. So therefore we can trust him. So the question is still a good question. Asked, why did the women go to the front to feed the women? And so the Gemara, here we bring the pasuk in Tehillim where it says Kol Kvuda Bas Malach Prima, that it's much more dignified for women to stay within, not to go to the borders, and some even for the women, men should go, not women. Sarah didn't come out to the Malachim because she was in a tent. She was a nidda at that stage, so she stayed in her tent. Just to finish the Gemara, it's Machlekes Tanoim. Rabbi says just a pasuk, no logic to it. Now, if it's just a pasuk, so how do you know? If gender doesn't mean anything, how do you know Amayni v'Amaynis? Because in this case, if it meant both, it should have said Amon and Moav. By saying Amayni, which is masculine, we dash in that way. By Mamzer, we said before, Mamzer is Mumzar. When it comes to Mitzri, what's the other word to say if you want to say generic? Mitzrayim, that's an extra letter. And the Torah always likes to be brief, right? Brevity is the most important thing. So therefore you had no choice but to say Mitzri, even though you meant male and female. But by Amoin, it would have been shorter if you meant both genders. Just say Amoin, Umayav. By saying Amoini and Moyavi, you're saying masculine. That's Rabbi Yehuda. Rabbi Shimon says, Shimon always dashes time with the crowd. Rabbi Shimon always tried to learn the reason behind the pasuk and have ramifications of halach. And here you have another example that only men should have been punished and not the women. We'll stop here. We'll continue tomorrow, Mitzvah Shem.